Hello, my name is Jason. I teach core French to grades 6, 7, and 8 in Ontario. And what I like to do with this video is to maybe address some of the challenges that I've come across while teaching core French and some of the ways that I've tried to resolve some of those challenges. The one that I want to talk about today is when we talk about conjugating verbs. Conjugating verbs, of course, is a challenge for a lot of our students. It was a challenge for me when I was learning French. So I think it's something that we all can sympathize with. In the past, when it came to verbs, I would, of course, have our verb chart, our je, tu, il, elle, nous, vous, and il and elle. And then we would talk about whatever verb that we're conjugating, whether it was specifically irregular verbs like être or avoir, aller, or when we were doing regular ER verbs, IR verbs, or regular RE verbs. And of course, as I teach them, and I'm going to use the ER verb as an example just because it's kind of easy at this point, we of course teach, or we tell students that if you have a regular ER verb, say regarder, so I'll just come over here, and of our verb it's going to be regarder, that what we do, of course, is we take off our ending, we find our stem, and then we add the appropriate ending based on the pronoun, the verb. So for example, je regarde, tu regarde, we add the es, e is our ending there, e would be the ending for il and elle. Then when we tell students when we come to nous for we, it would be nous regardons, vous regardez, and il or elle regarde, with the ENT ending. And then we would do this with our IR verbs and use the IR verb endings, and same thing with our RE verbs. And then of course we would give our students some practice, some of the exercises. We might give them a sentence like je blank la télé, and then they would look on the chart, look for je, and then they would be required to fill in the blank. And that's fairly simple, right? Students can look at the pronoun, look for the blank, and then look for the ending based on the chart. So in this case, je regarde, and off they go. However, one of the challenges that my students would face is when they would get a sentence that looks something like this. So instead of je or using the pronouns here, they might get a sentence that looks like this. Marie blank la télé. And many of my students would look at a sentence like that and look at the chart and be like, I don't see Marie on the chart. What ending do I use? And so I would explain to students that Marie, of course, is a proper name, and that if I was saying in English, Marie is doing something, what pronoun would I use to replace the word Marie so that I wouldn't have to keep saying Marie all over again? So for example, I might give them the example of Marie is going to the concert. Marie is going to pick up her friends at 8 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, Marie, and so students would eventually pick up that, oh, Marie, she. So they would look here, elle means she, and then realize Marie regarde la télé. And they would, at that point, then kind of figure it out and then move on. However, the problem with that, or the problem that I came across with this, was that students really, at that point, still didn't really understand what was happening when we conjugate a verb. They didn't understand the sort of the grammatical point of view. And I know grammar, or teaching explicit grammar for a long time, has been sort of really out of favor. And I'm not totally against that. However, in Ontario, certainly with a push in English on going back to a basics approach, phonics, phonemes, morphemes, graphemes, sort of focusing on the building blocks of language, the board that I work in has also been doing that with its French program, certainly in its the primary grades, is to create a phonological and morphological awareness of French, which I think is a really smart move. I think once you understand how the mechanics of language work, it gets a lot easier. So this year, what I began to do with my students, rather doing just sort of kind of a one-off, like if you see a proper name, replace it with a pronoun, and then that would give you where it should be on the chart, I would explain to students the fact that the verb, when conjugated, needs to agree with the subject of the sentence. And I know any French teacher worth their salt would be like, oh, duh, that's of course. We all know that. We do that in English, we do that in French. That the verb has to agree with the subject. The reality, of course, is a lot of our students don't really understand that idea. They do it instinctively when they talk or when they write. They do it and they know it, but they can't explain it. They don't understand the process. So what I started doing this year is I take my chart. I'm going to erase that for a second. Erase these. Just make some room here. What I would do with my chart is I would let students know why the chart looks like it does. I explain to students that whenever they see a verb chart with the pronouns, it's almost always going to look like this. Je, nous, tu, vous, il, elle. And so I explain to students that at the top, that this column represents singular pronouns. I, just by myself. Tu, as in you singular, if I'm just talking to you by yourself, I would use the pronoun tu, and then il and elle, he and she, individuals. And then in this column, of course, nous is for we, myself plus one or multiple other subjects. Vous, in French, of course, because there's two words for you, the singular tu. Vous, if I'm talking to a group of people and referring to you as a whole group. And then il and elle for they, a group of masculine subjects and a group of feminine subjects. And students have a hard time with this one a little bit because they have to remind themselves that il, even though it's for a masculine, as a masculine plural subject, if the group is mixed gendered, male and female, you're still going to use il. And if the group is only females, then you use elle. So once we kind of explained that point, then I would expand my chart. I'm going to use a bit of blue here, I think. I would expand it to explain on the horizontal end of things that we have first person, second person, and third person. And of course, once I did that, I would then draw the examples. And certainly by grade 6, most students understand first person and third person perspective. They've done enough reading to understand that first person perspective is from that person's point of view, me, myself, I. And they also understand that third person perspective is when you're talking about kind of like as the omniscient narrator. I use the example of Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or any kind of novel where the narrator kind of talks about everybody. Second person is a little trickier in terms of narrative just because there aren't as many examples. But again, I kind of explain if I'm using second person, it's when I'm talking to, again, you or either whether singular or as a whole group. And so we have first person, second person, and third person. So then I explain that the pronouns match on the chart. So if I'm talking about myself in the first person, singular, I'm going to use je. If I'm talking about me and, again, another person or multiple people, I would use the first person plural. And then what I would do, and this I do as a whole class instruction, is then we look at the verbs again. So I'm going to use regarder again as our example. So je regarde and nous regardons. So then I explain that if the subject is singular in first person, you're going to use the appropriate ending. And again, in this case, I'm just using a regular ER verb. This applies, of course, to every single verb. If I was using être, then if I'm talking about first person singular, I would use je suis. And if I'm talking first person plural, I, of course, would use sommes for nous sommes and we are. Once I explained that, then of course I would give them their exercises. So if I gave them then a sentence, something like, mon frère et moi, blank, we'll say, mon frère et moi, la télé. We'll just use the verb regarder. Students would then understand, once they figure out, they would look at the chart and say, okay, mon frère et moi, my brother and me. Okay, so it's definitely plural. We're talking about more than one person. So it's going to be in this chart. And because moi is the subject, is the subject here, moi, me, it's first person. So it's first person plural, and the verb is regarder. Therefore, we need to use nous regardons. Because mon frère et moi, the subject, is in the first person and is plural. And I found that once students kind of grasp this, they start understanding the mechanics of conjugating verbs a little bit easier. As I said, I've just started this year, so I actually still got a lot of work to kind of finesse what I'm doing. But I just wanted to, I guess, just take a couple moments to explain kind of how, what I've been seeing in my classes, and trying to improve students' understanding of how to conjugate verbs. Because I really believe that once they understand the mechanics, once they figure out that the pronouns, the subject, which is the subject of the sentence, the verb has to agree with that subject. And once they figure out that it's either first, second, or third person and in singular or plural, then they are then able to figure out the sentence, how to conjugate the verb into a sentence. And it also helps them when they're reading and they come across a verb and they see whether it's like regardons, or if we're using, say, allez, vous, allez. Again, they recognize that as a plural second person subject, which makes what they're reading more comprehensible. So I do this I started this as I said, I think earlier, as a whole class instruction, and then I will work with small groups and individuals to make sure that they are grasping the principle. Anyway, I know this has been a bit of a rambling video. I hope this is somewhat useful. I know once I started doing this like this year, I found this to be a really helpful tool. Students, I think, understand it a bit better. So when they come across sentences that don't just simply use the pronoun in the sentence, they are able to recognize the subject of the sentence and then make the verb agree according to that subject. They understand that process, and it makes it I don't know if a lot easier, but certainly a bit easier for them to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I find with grades 6 to 8 students, one of the reasons why they have a really hard time with French, or really enjoying French, or having any kind of interest in it, is they really don't know what they're doing. They don't really understand the language. And once they start understanding it and the mechanics of it a little bit, at least they understand why they're doing it. And it does make it, I've found that with some of my students, I get a little bit more buy-in. That's nothing miraculous, but I do get a little bit more buy-in when they kind of understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Until the next time, au revoir.